All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Chapter 11 Terrorist Violence and Role of the Media. This week, I'm wearing a Missouri State hat. Again, might want to remember that. All right. So, um, basically, we're talking about media attention here. So, as we've said 100 times, attention is one of the main goals of terrorist groups and movements. And one of the main types of this type of attention is attention from the media, obviously. So the media has this kind of interesting role in the reporting of terrorist incidents. So on the one hand, it's their job to report the news, right? They need to tell people what's going on. If there's a terrorist attack, right, the people should know about that. On the other hand, the media and have to make sure they're not being co-opted by these terrorist groups and turned into a mouthpiece for them, right? So they do these incidents to get attention. It's media's job to report the news, which a terrorist attack is obviously news, but at the same time, they have to try to not become a mouthpiece for this terrorist organization, about their grievances and their beliefs and like all these things, right? So kind of this old adage of knowledge is power, right? I'm sure you all have heard of that. Or information is power. So this is all that is very relevant, right, to this discussion. So you have governments and media outlets, they understand how powerful this can be, but they're not the only ones. Okay, terrorist groups and their audiences also understand how powerful information is, how powerful media attention is. So both sides understand, kind of what's at stake here. So of course, in this context, right, when I say media, we're talking about more than just news. Okay, we're talking about more than just like your network news, at 6 o'clock and 10. Talking about things like social media and any other kind of form of media that terrorists may use. There's so many different kinds of media out there right now, so it's more than just strictly your network news or even cable news, right? Any kind of media. So if you're looking at covering these terrorist incidents, it's important to look at it from both the media outlet perspective as well as the government perspective. So first, the media. Uh, Traditionally, and the standard, really that any serious journalist should probably strive for is to report the news objectively without much spin. Spin is when you have opinionated material included in the reporting of the news. Opinionated, some people call it interpretation. It's kind of both, okay? And it could be much more opinion, right? Spin is kind of this broad kind of category of things that aren't just objective. All right, so when you're talking about things like terrorist incidents or other types of news, obviously you got to have a little bit. Sometimes you need some interpretation. Sometimes this interpretation is required, right? So people can understand, kind of the context of what's going on and kind of the whole, what's happening right now. Especially if you're talking about things like terrorist incidents. But the amount of spin is oftentimes a decision made by the news outlet or whoever is reporting the story. So when a story comes to the attention of the media outlet, it goes through a kind of selection process called news triage. So at this point, editors are deciding what information will be reported and how it will be reported. So at this point, this is where bias starts to get introduced into the reporting of the news. So depending on how decisions are made, kind of during this triage phase, it's going to impact the audience's understanding of the incident. All right. So then you have these policymakers in the government. So that's the media perspective. So now government perspective. Policymakers in the government need to create this coherent and consistent policies concerning terrorists, especially after terrorist incidents. So the challenge of these policies is that not only do they have to be effective at addressing the terrorist, issues that are happening, but they also have to be accepted by the public. And sometimes those are two very, very different things. Okay, so one way the governments try to influence the population at large is through the use of the media. So if the government control the media's spin, about a terrorist incident or some other policy they're creating, they can sway public opinion because the media is very, very powerful at doing that. However, when the government tries to do this or tries to control portions of the media, it can lead to contention or hostility between the media and the government um, in places that profess to have freedom of the press. And this isn't just at the federal level; like this happens at all levels of government and media, even down to local papers and local governments. So, because the terrorist groups are trying to use the media to publicize their cause, you have the media here kind of walking this fine line between reporting the news and disseminating, the terrorist message. So, in theory, right? So the media should know this. They should be cognizant of this and be very, very cautious of how they report and what they report. But we obviously know in practice it's not how things are done. This is not how things go. Um, you have some that try to do that. You have other media outlets that are just blatantly sympathetic to one side of a conflict and completely unsympathetic to the other. This happens more in places where you have authoritarian governments or authoritarian states where the government controls the media. Because if you have that, then obviously the media is going to take the side of the authoritarian government. Terrorists also try to use the media to publicize their, uh, to not only publicize their cause, but also try to persuade others that what they're doing is justified. So not only just trying to just make people aware, but also try to persuade people that hey, what we're doing is right, and we need your support, blah blah blah. So groups that are very serious about this, very serious about using the media, will oftentimes establish an above ground media arm of their organization that attempts to cultivate relationships with the media. And you'll see this, some of these kind of long running terrorist groups will have, an above ground, legitimate, type organization that handles public relations for them. So you end up with this really interesting dynamic between these above ground, legitimate, quote unquote, organizations and these media outlets. But the best way for terrorists, really to get their message out is through the use of mass communications. This way, mass communications is available now because of all the technology and all the different outlets that people have. But this way, terrorists can control their message, and they can do that a lot more than like traditional news outlets. It's hard to control what they say, right? But if you're doing your own kind of mass communication, it's much easier to control the message. You can craft the message however you want. You can disseminate it however you want. So mass communication is things like printed material, audio broadcast, video broadcast, internet, social media, like literally mass communications. Whatever can be used to communicate en mass communications. And we're talking about things. We're not talking about just propaganda here. We're talking about also recruitment, and other things that the group deems necessary. They can use this communications for all these different things now. So spend some time in the book and the PowerPoint reading about print media, radio, television, internet, social media, or social networking. Spend some time in there reading about that. Part of this mass communications now too, and kind of this stuff that, it's always kind of been around, but much more popular, I guess. There's a lot more of it now. It's kind of this quote unquote new media. And this is not traditional media like we're used to. These are a lot more of your opinionated talk show, kind of tabloid type reporting. They'll use existing tech or alternative broadcasting methods to disseminate information, but it's not just objective. This is what's going on in the news, right? This is all bias and spin opinions, and no one expects it to be regular news media. Okay, but this is becoming more and more popular, and Where this becomes an issue is when people don't understand that it's not regular news. But that's another thing that terrorists can use to their advantage. All right, so let's talk a little bit more in depth about how the media decides to report on incidents. We talked about news triage, where the decisions are made. But if you kind of look at how, if you did a study at what media decided to do, and this is where that Cermak article that I posted in Blackboard, this is where this article comes into play. So you need to make sure you read the Cermak article. But how the media decides to report incidents, there's been no consistency on which incidents are covered or how they're covered. Now, we're not talking about huge things like 9/11. Okay, everyone covered 9/11, and they continue to cover 9/11. But other things, it's really consistent about how they're covered. So the first thing you have to remember is that most of these media companies are controlled by larger corporations that are worried about market shares and profits. Okay, so this affects everything. Okay, so this would impact the decision of what to report, right? Which incident is going to attract the most attention? The more attention you have, the more market shares you have, the more profit you make. So if you don't have an actual terrorist incident, but then you can also have like personal stories will attract a crowd. So personal stories about people who were involved in terrorist incidents, things like that are chosen. So then you have to decide how you're going to report it. So how media outlets describe terrorist or terrorism is also inconsistent. This is where labeling comes in. We've talked about labeling before, right? Well, media are very aware of the impact of labeling. So they use labeling and they also use euphemistic language. So euphemistic language is language you use that makes things sound not as bad as what it actually is. There's some examples of verbiage and stuff in the book to look at. And so next time you're watching the news or reading a news article or something, look for this kind of stuff. Look at how they use labeling. Look at how the different language they use and how it makes you feel when you're reading it. Right? It really is play on words, right? But it does. It impacts how people perceive what they're reading. Terrorists are also very adept at using labeling and realize the power of using labeling. Terrorists will use labeling to dehumanize their targets. Because it's much easier to attack somebody or kill people if you dehumanize what they are. If you don't think of them as actual people, but rather these things. Okay, and it is a common trait among pretty much all violent groups, regardless of ideology. This isn't a left thing or a right thing. This is a terrorist group thing. All right, so another way that terrorists try to control, manipulate the media is through manipulating the scoop. Okay, and the scoop is being the first to report the news. Right? We've all heard this term, I'm sure. So especially in this 24-hour news cycle, or excuse me, constantly, trying to gain the market shares or whatever. So even if there really isn't a terrorist event happening, a media outlet may do a story about a terrorist group or something related to terrorism. When this happens, there's a good chance a terrorist movement or group can manipulate the story, to their advantage to provide a scoop for the news or for themselves. All right. All right. So we're going to jump ahead a little bit to discuss regulation of the media. And this is an important topic because this topic goes to the very foundation of our nation. Freedom of the press is an important component of the United States and other democracies, but especially the United States. So, but how much freedom the press has in different countries varies, regardless of whether or not the country professes to have freedom of the press. So the main arguments here are: does the public deserve to know everything? Okay, and should the press have, enjoy the liberty to report information to the public as they see fit. Um, Others believe that the media should not be able to report on things that are unpleasant or deemed, not important for public consumption. Well, then what about when national security is at stake? How much should the media be allowed to report on? When you're talking about things like national security. I thought, when they used to embed, reporters with, troops, over in the Gulf and over Iraq and Afghanistan. Sometimes those reporters, were kind of giving away what our troops were trying to do, and I often thought, why in the world are we letting people do that? But we have freedom of the press here. So one of the things that um, the media and journalists claim um, should keep governments from having to regulate the media is journalistic self-regulation or media gatekeeping. Media gatekeeping, where essentially the media regulates itself. The journalists regulate themselves. So they have these ethical foundations that they adhere to, these established standards of journalistic self-regulation. And as long as everybody agrees to those and follows those, then there's really no need for media regulation. Well, but what happens when they don't? Um, Sometimes governments outright just regulate the press, in what are called state regulated presses. Other places, profess freedom of the press, um, and then you have the government selectively releasing information, controlling information to the press, holding information back, and even in other places like Britain, France, and Germany that say they have freedom of the press, they all have government affiliated, which means government run networks, and those networks are expected to promote the accepted standards of professional conduct and practice self-regulation for the sake of good taste and national security. Obviously, we don't have anything like that in America, right? We don't have any government-run media. State-regulated press is when the state routinely gets involved in the reporting of what is reporting the information by the press. So they decide what the press reports. Now, how much intervention depends on type of government. Under authoritarianism, the press can be privately owned, but information is officially censored, and you can be punished for publishing unfavorable information. When you get into more totalitarianism, the state controls the information reported to the media, and all the press is government run. So if you're talking about these kind of situations, like state-regulated press, terrorists can't depend on the media in those kind of places because the government simply won't let them, sensationalize the incidents or, give them credence or do anything unless the state wants to. Okay, so there's no way terrorists aren't going to rely on that. All right, I'm going to stop here. Please be sure to read the material in the book. I'll read the CERMAC article, study the PowerPoints, and complete your assignment for this week. As always, please let me know if you have questions.